Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. The theme today is neglected books, strange, sometimes peculiar neglected books that have hung around in the house for years and years. Obviously for a reason. One day they will find their moment, but they haven't yet. I'm going to talk through some ridiculous books from my shelves. Some of them are ridiculous. Some of them are just strange. But they've all been here quite a long time. I have read some of this. It's not a cozy, but it's a mystery story from, I think, the 40s or 50s. The Devil Was Sick by Mary Durham. It's the best title. And look at the devil in the sky. And the Gothic woman fleeing from the house and the tree. A Gothic mystery, I would call it. I think I read half of it and was disappointed because it wasn't as exciting as the cover suggested, but that's life, isn't it? A modern development in medical science enables Nicholas Sorrell, is it Sorrell? Anyway, at the age of 27 to resume normal life after 10 years of invalidism following a football accident. During his illness, the lives of the Sorrell family have revolved around Nicholas, and his gentleness and courage have been something of a legend. But Nicholas, restored to health, undergoes a strange metamorphosis. In his feverish desire to make up for the lost years, he becomes selfish and irresponsible, insults the sister who has tended him during his illness, quarrels with the doctor whose devotion has led to his cure, and finally deserts the girl whose affection he has won to embark on a love affair with his brother's wife. The life of the family is disrupted, and the antics of the former invalid culminate in a night of tragedy and horror, the events of which provide Chief Inspector March of Scotland Yard with the most unusual case of his career. It's the Thriller Book Club in, I guess, the 1950s. Everything about this is guaranteed to make you feel nostalgic for a time you never even lived in. The Thriller Book Club presented books by famous writers and put them in a kind of uniform edition, clearly. And they had people like Agatha Christie, John Creasy, Eric Ambler, Ngaio Marsh, Mickey Spillane. It would have been wonderful to subscribe to such a thing and to have covers like this. Just the address, the Thriller Book Club, 101 Charing Cross Road. By the same author, just the list of titles. I love lists of titles where they conjure up crazy images in your head. Hate is my livery. Why pick on pickles? Cornish mystery. Keeps death his court. Crime insoluble. Murder hath charms. Castle Mandragora. Forked lightning. So you can see why I'd jump at this. It's on that very thin, frangible paper, wartime, not quite wartime, but pulpy. Maybe I'll come back to this one day. The title's on the back. Recent and forthcoming Thriller Book Club selections. Killers Must Eat, Manning O'Brien. Death in Dark Glasses, George Bellairs. The Case of the Borrowed Brunette, Earl Stanley Gardner. One Lonely Night, Mickey Spillane. It's interesting. It's a kind of mix of what we would now call hard-boiled detectives with cozies. Yes, I think I might return to this. This is The Witches by Françoise Mallet-Jory, who I think looks very French on the back, very glamorous and French. I don't think this has Three Tales of Sorcery, published in 1969. Part 1, Anne or Theatre. Part 2, Elizabeth or demonic love. Part 3, Jean, or revolt. They're set in different eras. 1620 for the first one. I actually thought this was a non-fiction book. I had this mixed up in my head with a book about witchcraft that was on the shelf for years and years, but it's not that. Somebody stuck the blurb in the back. That's weird. The heroines of this unusual book are 3 widely differing women, all of whom existed in historical fact. Anne is the motherless daughter of an itinerant peddler dragged along flinty lanes in the back roads of country France. Sleeping in wayside ditches or low country inns, this wild, solitary child finds security from a time when she's placed in a convent in the care of kindly nuns. From this temporary shelter, she re-enters the world as a domestic. This is quite long-winded. Blah, blah, blah. The world of Christina's household is an equivocal one, filled with the scent of sex, fear, and an unnameable evil. Now, this is more like it. Anne has no preparation for dealing with such a life and easily becomes enmeshed in satanic practices. On Christmas Eve, 1625, she was condemned for her sins to be burnt at the stake. And then we jump to a different era, I think, and another witch, and then a third witch who is the most troubling of the 3. Daughter of a woman who's been burned alive for practicing sorcery, she has the strength and savage beauty of a hunted animal defending itself with the last breath. At the end, accused before a judge of witchcraft, Jean confronts her fate in scenes of shattering power. It sounds kind of terrible, but wonderful as well. Anyway, another one for the eventual pile. This I've had knocking around for years. Good old Beryl Reid, who was a comic actress and a kind of wit who would appear on quiz shows of all kinds, all sorts of shows when I was a kid. And she'd turn up in every sitcom and lots of dramas. And this was a memoir she wrote, in... I can't... 84. I think this is a memoir of her early life. So much love, an autobiography. She always looks kind of, I guess, sincere, but also like she's slightly taking the piss. And then, of course, she is in a restoration comedy, so you know that you can tell at a glance, she had this very kind of rarefied sense of humour. So she was kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek about everything. That's a nice way of putting it. There's little, as they call them, tip-ins. There's a bookmark with tulips, and I think that might be a photo. Tip-ins is the phrase for things that you find inside a book. I think it meant things that publishers slipped inside books, like errata slips, correcting mistakes. There's somebody's photo. It looks like a discarded, slightly large passport photo of some older lady. Yeah, this again isn't quite what I thought it was. I thought it was a more chatty book about her life and cats. I think there is a book like that she did, maybe as her second book. This is the more kind of formal gallop through her stage career and film career. I hope she's got some good stories. Any book like this has to live up to, for me, has to live up to David Niven and his Hollywood memoirs. I like books about actors and showbiz. I don't particularly like talking to actors because they just talk about themselves. But yeah, anything that actors do or write has to live up to David Niven for me. Right, This is something I've meant to read for years and years. Ira Levin, Stepford Wives. Now, he wrote this and Rosemary's Baby. He wrote the novel and he wrote the screenplays, I believe. And both are two of my favourite movies. I've read Rosemary's Baby, the novel, and it's fantastic. I remember buying a lovely edition of it in a very nice bookshop in America. And I was in Carlisle, in Pennsylvania. And I sat all one afternoon on a settee in the middle of this bookshop, hidden away inside a labyrinth, and just read most of Rosemary's Baby. For some reason, I've never dug into the book of Stepford Wives. I think because the book of Rosemary's Baby is so close to the movie, it's its own experience, but it's not as rich as it might have been, if that makes sense. And I assumed it would be the same with Stepford Wives. That is such a complicated film anyway, such a peculiar, ambiguous film. And I've meant to read the book. This is Jeremy's copy that's been on the shelves for years and years. And I just suddenly thought, looking along a few bookcases, I've never read that. It's a neglected book from our shelves. What I've done is gone through the whole house, looking at different bookcases, thinking, what's that? Why have I never read that? And sometimes there's a good reason, sometimes there's not. I'm not sure about Psychic Pets, what the reason is for this. I don't know how long this has been on the shelves. Psychic Pets, the living link connecting us to our past, our future, and the hidden powers of our minds. The Secret World of Animals by Joseph Wilder. Look at that drawing on the front. They look absolutely crazy. Christmas 1981. This is the inscription inside. To dearest Sue, so that you can have a good chat to Jasper. Lots of love, Louise. Kiss. We clearly bought this for £1 or even 50p. They're all crossed out. The price has gone down from £4.50 in one charity shop, one second-hand shop, to £1 to 50p. Nobody seemed to want this. Having studied all manner of pets, from parakeets to palominos, for nearly 20 years, Joseph E. Wilder has arrived at the startling conclusion that animals can and do understand our thoughts and speak to us in silent telepathic language, that they can perceive and warn us of danger, find us over hundreds of miles, act intuitively in harmony with our unexpressed desires, and even display uncanny scientific abilities such as warning us of earthquakes and assisting our advanced missile guidance systems. I can't see how a cat doing any of this. In dozens of actual case histories, as well as 16 pages of photo illustrations, Psychic Pets shows that what other people have sensed for centuries, that our animal friends live in tune with all nature, just as human beings did thousands of years ago, documenting blah, 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 the strange world largely ignored by conventional science of occurrence and intelligence that cannot be explained by our normal understanding of the physiological abilities of animals. Of the many documented cases, here we go, of psi training, two that were studied by ESP pioneer J.B. Ryan, noted for his research at Duke University, are particularly fascinating. Sugar, a cat, who journeyed nearly 1,500 miles from Anderson, California to Gage, Texas, to find her owner's new home. I am fascinated by those stories where cats, and sometimes dogs, follow their owners impossible distances, like in The Incredible Journey, a novel that I read a few years ago. And a much publicised pigeon who travelled more than 120 miles to visit his injured owner in the hospital and took him some grapes. An Airedale who solved complex mathematical problems, tapping out the answers in a pre-arranged code. A filly named Lady Wonder, whose unusual linguistic proclivities were communicated by way of a specially built typewriter with hoof-sized keys. I don't know if this is for real or not. There's got to be a photo of the typewriter with giant keys. There's just pictures of cats and dogs, not doing anything particularly special. You can't tell if they're clever or not. Cats always look more intelligent. Anyway, I think it sounds interesting. Now, here's something I should have read, and I haven't. Beryl Bainbridge's, one of her most famous novels, Every Man for Himself, which came out in 1996. And I found myself a hardback copy sometime after the event. I've got a paperback somewhere, but I've never quite managed to read it. And I don't know why. I've never sat down with it. I love stories about the Titanic, even that dopey one on ITV after Downton Abbey. Julian Fellowes did a series about the Titanic featuring lots of different characters, and each episode would follow the progress of different groups of characters through the night that the Titanic sinks. But it meant that every single one of the 6 episodes finished with the Titanic sinking, which was a bit depressing after a while, to be honest. It was so stupid. This man writes series that have you completely hooked. I love Downton Abbey. It's a stupid, snobby, ridiculous programme with a kind of ethos that is stupid and snobby and conservative and awful. But I was hooked. The Titanic thing was dopey as anything. Why finish every episode the same way? Why set it up like that? But apart from that, I love novels that are about the Titanic. I love Rosie Godwin's Maiden Voyage, for example, from a few years ago. There was another one I read on the centenary, I think. But this was in 1996. And the weird thing about this was when I had read with Beryl at King's Lynn Book Festival. It was my first year as a published novelist. And I was invited to this festival in King's Lynn, which was hilarious for all sorts of reasons. There was lots of kind of interesting people there, lots of funny people, lots of eccentrics. And we had an afternoon tea in King's Lynn. And somewhere I've got the handwritten receipt from the old-fashioned waitress listing everything we went through. And it begins with a pot of tea, then a pot of coffee, then a cake each, then another cake, and then more tea, then a bottle of wine, then 2 packets of fags, and then a bottle of whiskey. It was quite a long tea time, and we became firm pals, and she had lots of interesting stuff to say and lots of interesting things to impart to me as a fledgling young novelist. The 2 things I remember through the haze of that King's Lynn afternoon in a cafe were never fall in love until you're 30 and never drink alcohol while you're writing. Anyway, she was about 20 pages into her Titanic book at that point, and she had to finish it that summer. And later in the summer, I went to visit her at a house in Camden, and to go and have tea again, sitting in her front room. And it was the classic thing of the giant stuffed wildebeest in a hallway. All the kind of legendary stuff was true, and her kind of her lovely eccentricities, and she was really chatty and really funny and sweet, and we had tea with whiskey in the middle of the afternoon. But she told me about finishing this book. She'd finished it the night before, right up against the deadline, the final deadline, and she was so absorbed in the work and obsessed with finishing it that she had hallucinated herself into thinking she was aboard the Titanic. And the courier, the motorcyclist, came the next morning to pick up the typed manuscript to whiz off to the publishers because they were that close to the deadline. And she said she came down the stairs to answer the door with the manuscript, thinking she was on board the Titanic. And the water was rising and she could taste the salt water. I was amazed. I don't know if she was having me on. She might have been. She was an actress. She was very prone to self-mythologizing. But it was a great story. And I don't know why I didn't eventually read the book. I've got a beautiful copy of this now, so maybe it's about time that I did. In some ways, you worry about the book not living up. When you know the person, when you know the legend, you worry about the actual book not living up to it, but I'm sure that can't be right. I'm sure it's fantastic. In some ways, the books that you hold back are your kind of insurance against boredom in the future. You know they're there. There's that word again, that Japanese word, sungduko. Duku? Sounds like something out of the Star Wars prequel trilogy, I know. But the idea that there is safety and comfort and luxury in having too many books to even read. This is Enamoured of an Ass. It's a donkey anthology. And it's for real. It's edited by Stella Walker. And it kind of breaks my heart because I spent some time during lockdown not identifying with what we're talking about. Sending money to a donkey sanctuary, and I would get postcards back from the donkeys. And then they told me my donkey, Eeyore, had retired from the what I thought already was a retirement home. He'd gone to the countryside. I think they were telling me that he was dead, but in a kind of very oblique way. And I would have preferred to know the truth. Anyway, I got quite attached to all these donkeys. I'd get all these donkey magazines. It's a whole world. Because they're treated very badly, of course, often by people. They don't have a good life. And so I was glad to send some money. Sponsor, that's the word. Sponsoring a donkey, not identifying with them. I'm sure I did identify with them as well. So this is true. This is real. Angus and Robertson published this in probably the 70s or 80s, 77. The chapters. Donkeys defined. Donkeys diverse. Donkeys delectable. Donkeys delinquent. Donkey deals. Donkey doctrines and dictums. The donkey triumphant. For this anthology, Stella Walker has unearthed a mass of fascinating information and illustration on the donkey and his more or less troubled relationships with man. Comedy abounds. Hilarious accounts, blah, blah, blah. Uncanny grasp of human psychology. We're back to the psychic animals. There's experts involved. Oh, and of course, a section from Winnie the Pooh. And lots of black and white photos of donkeys, wild asses in Somalia. The title is not without a certain ambiguous wit that I don't think the double entendre was actually meant. Right, lastly, I've gone over time. I've had this for almost 30 years. Open Skies, Open Minds by Nick Pope. For the first time, a government UFO expert speaks out. Now, I was given this by Jed Mercurio, the TV writer, when I worked writing an episode of his show, Invasion Earth, and this was one of the set texts, which we all dipped into. I don't think I read the whole thing, but it was a big deal at the time. It was a British Ministry of Defence fella who left his job and kind of did a whistle-blowing book about how many aliens they'd actually encountered and UFOs, and that was the BBC slip with best wishes from BBC Scotland TV drama. And it was in the wake of The X-Files, as was Jed Mercurio's TV show. I found the script of my episode recently. I told the story on this channel a little while ago about everybody else's episodes being fighting and guns and military and planes and flashbacks to the war, and mine was set in a village in Scotland And it was mostly two old ladies in a toilet block, sitting in their cubicles trying to give piddle samples to find out whether they'd been infected by an alien mutant virus. Anyway, this is the blurb for Nick Pope's book. Then I went back to the files, and the harder I looked, the more my amazement grew. Something very strange was going on, and clearly I wasn't the first in the Ministry of Defence to think so. Nick Pope works for the Ministry of Defence as a higher executive officer, the ranking equivalent of a major in the British Army. Blah, blah, blah. He was appointed to, from 91 to 94, he was appointed to the UFO desk. His job was to investigate and analyse claims of UFO sightings. This is all massively out of date now, of course, isn't it? Because they've all said, yeah, there were UFOs. Everywhere. Everywhere. Everything they said on the X-Files was all true. Now, for the first time, he reveals it's hard to remember how shrouded in mystery all of this was, how foolish people felt for talking about UFOs and things. Maybe they still do. He reveals the contents of the government's X-Files, residing in the deepest vaults of the Ministry of Defence. He discovered that truth is much stranger than fiction, and something bizarre is going on, something beyond human experience and something potentially hostile. From starting out as a skeptic, he became a firm believer in the reality of UFOs. In Open Skies, Closed Minds, Nick Pope presents convincing arguments in support of the existence of UFOs by using cases that he's researched in his official capacity, and warns that extraterrestrial spacecraft are visiting Earth and that something should be done about it urgently. It's very British, isn't it? Something needs to be done about this. It's appalling. It makes a good companion piece to the hysteria and paranoia of the books by the man who wrote Communion. His name's dropped out of my head. Communion and all those sequels. No, it's gone. But they are kind of absolutely hysterical. This is much more a fella who works at a desk saying, nope, it all needs talking about. It needs to be legislated against, this kind of nonsense. Anyway, that looks interesting as well. So I hope you've enjoyed this ramble through my ridiculous pile of neglected books. I wonder if you've got the same, or if you're more sensible and don't accumulate this kind of thing. I hope you do, though. I think it's a very kind of readerly thing to be to have your interest pricked by odd things, whether it's donkeys or aliens or Stepford wives or actresses in particular movies, and you end up with books about them, and you've forgotten why you were interested in the first place, or maybe they leapt off the shelf in a cheap shop. Anyway, they've kept my attention, and one day I might actually sit and read them cover to cover. Okay, see you again soon. Bye-bye.